from the Constitution. The Clean Water Act, as I said, is about 40 years old. It's at about 43 years old right now. Was passed back to stop rivers from burning, back to clear up the mess and the sludge that we made from industrialization. And the goals of the Clean Water Act are three. All the waters of the United States should be swimmable, fishable, and drinkable. That's the goal. You should be able to put a straw in a river and suck it up. This power from the Commerce Clause was applied when Congress said, look, we think that any water on which people trade is part of the trading system of the United States. If you can float a boat on it, it is navigable. And if it is navigable, it is water that should be controlled by the United States. And that makes sense when you think about trade. The problem with the Clean Water Act that is challenging to this day is what is navigable? How far upstream can you float a boat? Is this navigable? Is this navigable? We have had some Supreme Court decisions in the last 10 years that have actually made this more confusing than less. Our Supreme Court right now is actually philosophically divided. 4 justices are conservative, 4 justices are liberal, and there's one guy in the middle, Justice Kennedy. He drives environmentalists crazy. In some of our recent water decisions, they have split 4-4-1. And remember, it is the decision of the court. It is the writing of the court that is the law. So when you have 4 people say one law, 4 people say another law, and one guy in the middle say a law, the law is unclear, but the person you have to abide by is the one guy in the middle. This is Justice Kennedy. Again, he makes us crazy. He said in his last water decision that navigable waters are all waters that have some kind of connection with navigable waters. We don't know what that means. We can't tell. Many environmentalists have argued anything that has any hydrological connection, anything that might interfere with water downstream is regulated by the federal government. Property interests and industry often say if you can't actually float a boat on it, it's not navigable. This is actually an issue right now in the United States. And when I talk a little bit about public participation, I'm going to tell you how the EPA is trying to resolve this issue. But this is hot stuff. Generally speaking, we understand that anything that flows all year is at least considered navigable. It's all the fiddly bits. It's all the headwaters and the little ponds and the seasonal waters that are particularly at issue. I want to make sure I emphasize, because the federal government says anything that is navigable and anything that is connected to anything else that is navigable has federal jurisdiction, this means that all rivers are federal. There is no such thing as a state water. All waters in the United States are governed by the federal government unless they are so isolated as to not be connected. I think this is different, even if the river is just within the state. Generally, the Clean Water Act operates as a federal law, but the federal government gives power to state agencies to implement the law. It is a delegation and it is a permission that the state must earn. In red, way up in the corner, way up here, is my state of Vermont. The state of Vermont has an agency, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and it has been given power by the federal government to regulate the waters within the state. There are a few states that have either chosen not to get power for themselves or who have screwed up so badly that they are no longer allowed to manage their own waters. Particularly actually in the Southeast, down here, several of these states have had their authority taken away and the EPA regulates in those states. In Vermont, we regulate many bodies of water, but this is our Lake Champlain. It is a very, very large lake. If you heard of the 5 Great Lakes in the United States, Lake Michigan, Lake Ontario, this is the 6th Great Lake. People forget, but it's really there. The lake is shared between the state of Vermont, the state of New York, and Canada. What is interesting is that the state of Vermont and the state of New York both have permission from the federal government to regulate water quality. So long as they hit a floor, so long it is at least this good, the states may make their water quality standards better. They may choose. But they have to at least meet the floor. The state of Vermont has higher standards than the state of New York. Both meet the federal minimum, but the state of Vermont actually has higher standards. However, a little while ago, the state of New York and some NGOs said Vermont has good standards, but they do a terrible job of implementation. You are not actually following your law. Therefore, we think the EPA should take back the authority. And some NGOs actually filed a lawsuit saying the state of Vermont should have its delegation revoked. The state of Vermont said, no, we shouldn't, we're good, we're sorry, we will do better. And over about 6 years negotiated a settlement with the EPA with specific steps the state must do to retain its delegation authority. This sort of thing is common. The federal government has the authority and gives it to the states, but watches over what the states are doing. And if they're not doing well, gives them a little nudge. The Clean Water Act has two parts. The states are issuing discharge permits. We think of this as point source pollution, anything that comes out the end of the pipe. But those permits are based on the best technology available. Now let me be clear, the water coming out at the end of your pipe does not have to be clean. You have to show as a polluter that you are using the best technology you can find to clean up the water as best as you can before it goes out the end of the pipe. That's enough. And the standard is not the best technology, not technology from NASA or FIFA or anywhere else, but the technology that is commercially available, that is standard to the industry, but is the best that is standard in the industry. If you are using that technology and you can demonstrate that you are using that technology, then you can pollute. That is one of two philosophies we have in the United States on our environmental laws, and I just want to characterize these differences. A technology-based standard and a harm-based standard. The technology-based standard that we use in the Clean Water Act is essentially the question, can you do this? What technology can you use? You have to use the best technology. The other philosophy or principle we use is a harm-based standard. You have to do it. You have to be this clean, and if you're not allowed to pollute at all. And just as a contrast, the technology-based standard is used in the Clean Water Act. You have to use the best technology. If you use the best technology, you may pollute. The Clean Air Act is very different. It says you have to be this clean. And if technology does not exist for you to put out this clean of air from your smokestack, then you have to shut down. There are political reasons, there are historic reasons, there are economic reasons that these two standards are used in different places. But there are two very different philosophies that you will see in our different laws. The Clean Water Act has two large elements. Most of it is the permit. Most of it is this idea that point source pollution must be controlled using the best available technology. Unfortunately, even using the best technology does not mean that our waters became swimmable or drinkable or fishable. The technology wasn't that good, or sometimes even the best technology does not make your water clean enough. The law does not well regulate non-point source pollution, pollution that just comes overland from agriculture, from city streets, from rainwater. Instead, it says this: if everyone has their best permit, if everyone is using the best technology to control their point sources, then we'll look at the whole body of water. If at that time the whole body of water is still dirty, we will tell everyone that we are going to make a plan for that body of water. That body of water will have what we call a total maximum daily load. This is as much pollution as can go into this entire lake. And then the agency will go backwards. It will go back to the permit holders and see if it can make them be a little cleaner. It will go back to the landowners and see if it can make improvements to the land to decrease the runoff. Until very recently, there was nothing mandatory about that. Once you got to the total maximum daily load, it was supposed to be voluntary compliance. At least the federal floor was voluntary compliance. Increasingly, we were finding new agricultural regulations that put a little bit of requirement at the federal level on runoff from land. But many states who are allowed to have higher standards have started actually putting in requirements. The state of Vermont just in the last year passed a permit for farms and said certain farms cannot pollute over land. And if you do, we're going to fine you, we're going to shut you down. But that is only at a few state levels. To this day, the non-point source pollution is not particularly well regulated, and the states in particular are struggling with good ways to do this. Voluntary compliance, citizen participation is good, but in many places has not actually solved the water problem. This is a picture of the Chesapeake Bay. Is anyone familiar with the Chesapeake Bay? The Chesapeake Bay is the area, it goes all the way from New York down to the Virginias, and it is a very large bay. I'm going to be very general, but I think this is true. Almost everyone on the Chesapeake Bay who has a point source has a permit and is complying. And the water is still terrible. And the water is still terrible because most of this area is agricultural. And it's not only agricultural, it's agricultural with cows. And cows are just terrible for water. We love our hamburgers, but cows are terrible for water. This area has tried for many years to use a total maximum daily load program to say this is how polluted the Chesapeake Bay can be, we have to clean it up. And it has used voluntary means and public participation and incentives and grants and children planting trees by the river, all sorts of things. The water has improved, but it is still not drinkable. It's kind of fishable. I wouldn't swim in it. It continues to be a challenge. This is one of the areas where we have tried to use public participation, and I think we have learned many techniques, but sometimes public participation and voluntary compliance alone will not necessarily solve a problem. This is the Cuyahoga River today. This is the river that burned. And again, I'm not sure that I would swim in it. I know many people who fish in it. I probably would not put a straw in it and drink. But we have had massive improvements. The Point Source Discharge Pollution Prevention Program, in particular, helped clean up the kind of industrial pollution that we were seeing in the 1970s. That was the scary stuff. That was what the law was focused on. It is now the non-point source pollution problems that we are finding more contentious and more difficult. Every once in a while, it happens all the time that there's some bad company that pollutes. And someone will, sue them, and there will be a big lawsuit, and there will be a big hoot to do. But we haven't had a river burn. We haven't had this kind of problem from straight industrial pollution, aside from a few accidents in 20 years. I think maybe the best way to see that change is to look at how people spend their money. This is a graph of how cities spend their money. The first column, the very large one, cities, municipalities, local governments. The first one is education. The blue line is water and sewage treatment. This is the second largest thing that our cities spend their money on in the United States. City sewage plants have pipes. They are point source pollution spaces, and that's really where the emphasis of the Clean Water Act has had an enormous effect. So I have been asked to talk about public participation, and I'm going to spend some time here, because I think it's interesting to hear about how the Clean Water Act engenders public participation. And I should say this is a model for what happens in most of our environments.